I hate to break it to you listeners, but it's not over yet. I've said it before and I'll say it again, Brexit is a journey. Like the one those contestants go on in the X Factor. That's right, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent. Coming to you as ever from the Red Lion pub, a short walk from the Houses of Parliament. Well, we're 1 week after Brexit night, on the next stage of our long-haul Brexit journey, known as the transition period. And although the government seems to have banned the Brexit word, there's one aspect of Brexit that everyone's talking about.
Trade matters.
We need to ensure that we do maintain good trade relationships with Europe.
We are ready to offer a highly ambitious trade deal.
There is no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules on competition policies, subsidies, social protection, the environment, or anything similar.
Trade. Will the UK strike a free trade agreement? How will cross-border trade challenges play out in Northern Ireland? And when will manufacturers receive much-needed clarity on this issue? Well, joining me on Chopper's Brexit podcast is a politician who has a wealth of experience on this matter. Dr. Liam Fox is a Tory MP for North Somerset. He was the government's International Trade Secretary from 2016 until Boris Johnson became Tory leader in 2019, and he was a vocal supporter of Brexit. And he joins me now in the Red Lion pub. Liam Fox, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Happy New Year. Still say that, can't I?
It seems a very long time ago.
Exciting times in the world of trade, isn't it? I mean, you heard Boris Johnson's speech on Monday, which I thought nailed the whole issue of a vision for trade in a way which Theresa May couldn't have done or didn't do when she was Prime Minister.
I thought it was a very good speech, and I thought it set out a number of things very clearly. I was naturally delighted to hear that we'll be using our freedom post-Brexit to push a global free trade agenda. That's absolutely necessary at the moment because we're seeing the growth in global trade down to something like 1.2% now.
What does that mean, sorry?
Well, normally we would see a rate of growth of world trade about twice the rate of global GDP. Actually, it's now about half the rate of global GDP. That tends in history to be a precursor of some not very good things.
That's less trade happening, less cross-border trade.
Less trade is happening. There are a number of reasons for that. The global economy slowed down a bit in 2018, but also China is responding to the trade tensions with the US by making more intermediate goods themselves rather than importing them. That will have an impact on countries like Germany, who are big exporters to China, and we've seen the slowdown in Germany as a consequence of some of those trade tensions. So reaffirming that was very positive. He also struck on the heart of a big global debate on trade, which is how do we basically organise our trading system? And there are two real alternative visions. One is the EU's version, which is so-called harmonisation. It's a very regulatory, legalistic way, and it basically says these are the things you must do to be able to trade with us. Now, the rest of the world doesn't like that. The rest of the world says we believe in concepts of equivalence. In other words, we want to maintain standards, of course.
What's an example? Light bulbs, for example. Is that basic?
Well, I'll give you a bigger example. Let's say financial services. We will say we all want to maintain financial stability and so on, but we think there are different ways of doing it. And the problem with the model of harmonisation is it locks us into today's practices. And it means that you can't use the market and increased efficiency and increased productivity to improve your competitiveness. And in many ways, this is the kernel of the European debate. Boris Johnson is saying we have got to be able to be free to do things our way.
To do better, get better.
To make ourselves more competitive, but in a fair and efficient way. And what the European Union is saying is, no, you must do it in this way. In many ways, it reflects sort of the traditions we have in our law, which is that for us, everything's permitted except those things that are not permitted, whereas it's the other way round under much European
and that's why
legal
we're
heritage.
For a lot of people.
Well, for me, I mean, I've just come back from Washington, and you say that, and I was explaining in Washington to an audience why I was a constitutional leaver, and they were saying, you know, what does this mean? I said, well, you can imagine in America, if there was a court in Mexico City or Ottawa that took precedence over your Supreme Court, and there was nothing your lawmakers could do if judgments were handed down. And they looked aghast at the concept of this. And I think that so it is getting through that.
Are they getting Brexit over there more than they
I think
were?
so.
Because previously I heard they weren't getting it, like California succeeding. I think that was a very strange thing to do.
Well, of course, I mean, you got to remember that the liberal bubble is the same in Washington as it is in London. And, it's like, how could you possibly not continue in this way? The concept of exercising sovereignty or the people wanting to be able to have the freedoms to do what suits them is as alien in metropolitan DC as it is here in Westminster. And of course, it's got exactly the same consequences in that the metropolitan bubble in London didn't understand the rest of the country in either the referendum or the latest election in the same way the metropolitan bubble in DC or in LA doesn't understand why Donald Trump's going to be re-elected in November.
Yes, which looks quite likely given the chaos with the Iowa caucuses this week and the fact they can't find a decent challenger to Trump. Were you advising on trade deals? What was your role? Are you doing some kind of in the shadows work here for Boris Johnson's government?
No, I was speaking to a think tank in the US about Britain's foreign and strategic vision post-Brexit, really making the point that we are not going to be introspective, that we will still be an outward-looking and increasingly an outward-looking country. We'll still have our permanent seat on the Security Council. We'll still be in the G7, the G20. We'll be key players in the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD. We're at the heart of NATO, the world's fourth biggest military, the world's fifth biggest economy. We're hardly bowing out and setting out why Britain's got a different vision from some of our European partners on a whole range of issues. So it was an interesting conversation.
Are you telling the government what you're doing? Are you in touch with the civil service? Are they supporting this work?
Naturally, I report back all the meetings I've got. Then that's part of the ability to have political contacts as well as governmental contacts.
Yes. So I wonder why you're not in the government yet then. You're looking forward to next week with the reshuffle?
I never give too much credence to these stories about reshuffles. I've been there 27, soon to be 28 years. I've seen a lot of reshuffles come and go. I've seen big reshuffles turn out to be small ones and small ones turn out to be seismic. So there's only one person who knows what's going to happen in a reshuffle. Everything else is utterly pointless speculation.
In terms of where we are at the moment with trade deals ready to roll over, there's about 120 billion I gather, with around 20 countries ready to roll over at the end of this year. Are we where we need to be? I know this is a big thing you were pushing when you were Trade Secretary, looking into the March 19 leaving dates.
So about 11.9% of Britain's trade is done through EU trade agreements with third countries. About 76% of that's, I believe, ready at the present time.
Are we in a good place, do you think?
We are in a good place. And of course, we've got this extra time. The extra time is important for countries like Canada in particular. There will be some countries like Turkey and San Marino, who are part of the customs union, where it will be impossible to get an agreement this side. But we will have to look at how our trade with them operates. And Japan, of course, will be the subject of a new trade agreement.
This year, maybe, as well.
Well, it may well be this year. I mean, I know that everyone's been concentrating on the areas where we already have finished the public consultation, but Japan, in many ways, will be more straightforward because it's not a new trade agreement. It will be, if you like, the EU trade agreement with Japan minus a couple of the bits that neither of us like, particularly around data movement and data localization.
It's quite easily done. You mentioned Japan there, Liam Fox, and it's been mooted that we might try and join this CPTPP, which you will explain what that stands for in a minute, but the idea that we join this kind of looking west into this kind of new trading area which would compete with the EU. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is the grouping that was negotiated that the Americans then pulled out of. Everyone thought it would collapse, but the Japanese effectively took on the leadership and completed the agreement. It contained a lot of the countries that Britain currently trades with and is looking for new agreements, including Australia and New Zealand. Japan, of course, is in there, Singapore, Vietnam, a lot of the countries that we've got a lot of interest in. The thing about getting into that wider grouping is twofold. Number one is it just does change global trading dynamics. CPTPP plus Britain is about the same share of global GDP as the EU minus Britain. But perhaps more importantly...
13% or so.
A lot more than that, it's about 18, 19%. Perhaps more importantly, I was discussing and the meetings in Washington that if Britain were to join CPTPP, it might make it easier for a future US administration to come back, given that it would be a slightly different entity with the UK in that. And that's got a lot of attraction for some congressmen who see the US moving back. Of course, were the US to rejoin after Britain, you're talking about a trade grouping that represents 42 or 43% of global GDP.
And this could happen by the end of next year, I've been told, anyway.
If you're talking about the end of 2021, yeah, that's potentially possible, I would think, that we can do that with goodwill. Britain's got quite a role to bring to global trade. We are seen as in many ways the birthplace of the concepts of free trade. But at a time when protectionism is rising, when more non-tariff barriers to trade are being erected around the global economy, people see Britain as the flag bearer for free trading concepts.
And the impact of us joining maybe the CPTPP on the EU talks could be quite interesting, couldn't it? Because it could force them to get that together and get to a position of doing a deal by the end of this year.
Well, when you're when you're in more than one negotiation at a time, it does bring us a leverage, that's for sure. But I think the EU is very preoccupied with its own navel still. It still has a particular model that it wants to follow. And I think two things from that. One is it shows that we were right when we said we couldn't have the status quo because Europe is metamorphosing into a single state. Their aim is ever closer union, and the logical endpoint of ever closer union is union. And I think they also have an economic model which they're going to try to force on the rest of the world in terms of trade and economics, that I think that they will find that they're the odd man out.
Boris Johnson described this as a three-dimensional chess, didn't he, in that speech? Do you think the machinery of government is fixed up for this? We've got the International Trade Department. Should there be a European Trade Department or ministry?
No, trade is trade, and once we get the European agreement done, it will fall within the same rules. And countries don't trade with countries. Companies sell to consumers. Mrs. Merkel doesn't sell Boris Johnson goods, nor vice versa. It's up to our companies and our consumers. And your country will do well when you can sell goods and services at a quality and a price consumers want. That's the bottom line. All the distortions being introduced into this debate will reduce efficiency and increase cost to consumers. And the one word you hardly ever hear in the trade debate is consumers. And it's time for Conservatives to be the champion of the consumers.
Liam Fox, on that note, thank you for being my guest on this week's Choppers Brexit podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, stay with me. After this short break, I'll be finding out why my next guest thinks we should trust the masses a bit less and the elites a bit more. Don't tell Dominic Cummings that. Back after this.
Hello listeners, I'm Danny Boyle, just interrupting Chopper to introduce myself. I'm the Telegraph's Commuter Editions editor, which means it's my job to provide you with great journalism that makes your journey to and from work as enjoyable as possible. I can't prevent train delays or guarantee you won't get caught in the rain, but I can make sure you're up to date with the best of the Telegraph every morning and evening. My colleague Chris Price and I produce briefings to bring you up to speed in just 2 minutes at both ends of the day. Now, they're also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search The Briefing or follow the link in the show notes to this episode.
Right, we're back in the Red Lion pub. We're often told that the Brexit vote was a vote against Britain's elite ruling class, and certainly that's the message pushed by Nigel Farage and many of his Brexit Party colleagues. But I have a feeling my next guest might have something to say about that. Garett Jones is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University in Virginia, USA. He's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes magazine, and is the author of a new book, 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust the Elites a Bit More and the Masses a Little Bit Less. And he joins me now in the Red Lion pub in the heart of Westminster. Garett, welcome to the pub.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's
a pleasure to be here.
Your first pub ever? Or
This is my first pub on this visit.
Is it? But you like pubs?
I do love British pubs.
Because we feel sorry if you're not having pubs. Not proper pubs.
No, we do not have proper pubs in the US.
You've got Cheers, obviously. That's real, right?
It's just disappointing.
But Cheers is a real thing. It's a documentary, Cheers.
Exactly.
From the 80s,
yes.
you know, Cheers.
It was actually filmed live before a studio audience while people were drinking for all those years. Yeah.
Correct. Listen, this book sounds so interesting. I mean, the title is pretty clear what it's about. But
Yes.
perhaps you might want to... Well, let's start where the idea came from.
Yes. I mean, basically, democracy is fantastic, but it's a little bit like spaghetti. Just because something's great doesn't mean you can't have too much of it. And what I emphasize is that a lot of the best things that we attribute to modern democracies are the undemocratic parts of democracies. So whether it's the independent judiciary, whether it's the central bank, whether it's the long terms for politicians that give them just a little bit of distance from the voters, a lot of the things we celebrate about democracy are the parts that are a little bit less democratic than we usually think. And so I decided to write a book that basically pulled together all of the strands I could find, partly based on my own experience as a staffer in the United States Senate, partly based on my experience as a monetary economist who studied central banks.
So Garett Jones, what are examples here of when democracy is bad and when not having it is a good thing?
Well, a great example is with central banks. So whether it's the United States Federal Reserve or whether it's the Bank of England, there's a lot of evidence that the more independent your central bank is from the democratic process, the better your outcomes are. And it seems like really a free lunch.
Longer term view, you mean, don't you?
Longer term view, disconnected from the short run political pressures to boost the economy just before an election, and a lot less pressure to lend money to the government when the government needs a couple of $1 billion here and there.
So is the problem that word election? Is that what this obscures and makes bad policy happen because it's all on a 5-year or 4-year view?
Well, it does appear that politicians do get worse before elections. We all kind of know that a lot of good policy doesn't happen. A lot of policy bills don't happen just before an election. But when we can actually, for instance, in the U.S. Senate has 6-year terms. And so we can check and see, do politicians vote for things that economists think are pretty good policy right before an election? And so one nice study looked at trade deals. And freer trade is something economists tend to support a lot. And it turns out that senators are a lot less likely to support free trade deals just before they're up for re-election. They're much more likely to support it when the election is 4 or 5 years out in the horizon.
That's because they open the door to cheaper imports or whatever. It's a job story.
Yeah.
So it's basically driven by jobs, that choice is.
Anything that's about short-run trade-offs and the trade-off between the short run and the long run. So, for instance, to pick a quite unrelated example, Mitt Romney yesterday was the first senator ever to vote to impeach and remove a member of his own party. Mm-hmm. And the media was quick to point out, he doesn't have to run for re-election until 2024. Yeah. So he has some distance from his very pro-Trump voters in Utah. So that distance from the voters gave him room for a little more political courage.
That's why we say in this country we've got a new landslide Tory government, Boris Johnson's Prime Minister,
yes.
And we're saying he needs to do all the difficult things now. So, for example, get the house building going now, which might be unpopular with some people who want to preserve their views or their neighbourhoods, but get that going now. So by the time the election comes around, it's happened and it's been forgotten about.
This is something that we all take for granted, even those of us like myself who are big fans of democracy. We know that you want to front load the pain so that a couple years from now, once the benefits are all showing up, the voters will think about that.
Don't you need that democratic mandate to remind these politicians of who put them there in the first place?
You absolutely do. This is, one of the great
trade-off.
Yes. So getting that balance right is something that we can do a better job of if we just talk about it more openly. It's very common to just attribute all of the bad things of modern governments to the insiders and discuss how they're bad and they're frustrating the will of the noble voters.
Yeah.
But instead, we should think of a trade-off between what the voters want in the long run and what the voters want in the short run.
I think, the premise of the book, and given we've been through this 3-year Brexit torture, which has done very well for our audience figures, they are our podcast, but it's been torture for a lot of people, that they might agree with you. They might feel that's enough MPs, Ed.
Yes, I'm hoping that... it's not that I think that all referenda are bad. Voters themselves seem to be quite skeptical of referenda overall. But 10% less referenda would be probably a step in the right direction.
That's almost certainly right. And of course, China is so fearsome because they have no actual... They're not governed by this 5-year... They've got this long-term plan, this inexorable journey towards... dominating the world or dominating the economy, or whatever how you describe it. And that's what's so slightly worrying for liberal democracies, possibly.
It is possibly, but I tend to think that, for one thing, the politics of countries with 1 billion people are something we don't know much about.
I mean, India is very, very democratic.
And India is in the same boat of being a country with 1 billion people, and knowing how democracy works in that country
is insane. It's insane.
Yes. So, but that said, India's democracy managed to do one of the great things you can hope for from a government, which is to eliminate famines. So Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate, pointed out that in his work, he found that no country that is a democracy has ever had a famine. So India had democracy. India had famines until just before India became a democracy.
Did you alight on the perfect form of liberal democratic rule in here?
No.
So, i.e., do you think it's no, you don't. So you don't.
The book
you don't pick
offers
sides.
a grab bag of policy reform options, and I hope that people will look at all the options and they will hate some and love others.
But trusting elites is so against where we are at the moment.
Exactly. But that's because people are usually comparing the elites to what they think government should be, how they think government should be run. They're comparing elites to utopia, to their dream world. They're not comparing elites to the actual alternative, which is the voters we have in front of us.
The word elite means elites who serve themselves, not the people, isn't it? That's the point.
Yeah.
That's what you're thinking about, isn't it, when you say the word elite?
I chose the word just because I knew if I didn't, people would attach it to me anyway. So,
are you in the elite?
By some measures.
You're a professor.
Right, I'm a professor. I've worked in the United States Senate.
Yeah.
I've written books with Stanford. I've been very fortunate.
Yeah.
At the same time, I'm the son of a union pipe fitter. So from a blue-collar background, when I go to economics conferences, I often note that I'm probably the only one who's one of the few around who's a first-generation college student. So I've kind of lived in both worlds in a way. But this is something that goes back to Socrates and Plato, which is on some parts of our government, we do want to be run by experts. And so the question is, how do we balance the goals of democracy, which is having the masses participate so that they don't get ripped off by the people running government, versus actually having good people who know what they're doing running the government? Yeah. This is a tension that will never be struck perfectly, but I think at least in our rhetoric and often in our practice, we've gone a little bit too far toward romanticizing the voter.
And finally, have you found the perfect balance in any country in the world yet through your tour de force?
No. Every country has its own small little bits of undemocracy, of oligarchy that seems to work fairly well, whether it's independent central banks in the US, whether it's the independent judiciary of Japan, whether it's the regulatory regimes of the European Union. Yeah. There's little bits here and there. And so we can take those little shards, put them together into something beautiful.
And why is it 10%, not 20 or 15 or 50%?
Well, the one reason is because work by Bill Easterly shows that countries that are in the top 25% of democracy never kill their own citizens, essentially. Right. And so if there's one thing...
go to war, do you mean?
No, I mean literally massacring your own citizens.
Right.
So when you think of basically killing your own domestic political opponents.
Yes.
So if there's one thing that I want out of governance, it's not killing your own people. And countries that just have a moderate level of democracy are really good at that one thing. Let's make sure that whatever reforms we have, we're still in the top quarter of democracy.
I think redefining the Sunny Uplands as not killing your own people is a great way to end this interview. Garett Jones, thank you so much. And the book called 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust Elites a Little More and the Masses a Little Less is available in all good bookshops from Stanford University Press now. Now, my next guest is very interesting because he was a pioneer in helping to push out the red wall for the Tory party and construct this blue wall, which was further strengthened in December's election when Boris Johnson won his landslide majority. Andy Street, the former chief executive of John Lewis Partnership, is standing for his second term as Conservative Mayor of West Midlands. If he wins this, it would be a historic victory for a Tory Metro Mayor. It's never been done before. And of course, by the time this podcast comes out this week, Labour will have chosen the candidate to fight him. So it'll be game on. I sat down with Andy Street a few days ago in the Red Lion pub to discuss why he wants another 4 years in the job, as well as how he thinks this first electoral test in May will reflect on Boris Johnson, the new Prime Minister. I started by asking him whether Boris Johnson's current reputation is a help or a hindrance in the West Midlands ahead of May's election. Is he getting any stardust from the new incumbent in number 10 Downing Street?
So we always need a bit of stardust, a bit of added help. But you're right when you say, although Boris had an incredible result in the West Midlands in December, 6 gains across our area, this was starting to happen before. And people have said to me, you were sort of the vanguard of this. Winning.
You and Ben Houch in Tees Valley.
Indeed so. And then we saw some of the councils in the industrial heartlands in Dudley and Walsall coming to us. So, there's been a trend here. And if you look at the Black Country, for example, 2005, we won just 1 seat. And we're now up to 10 out of 13. So there is a real trend.
There's momentum.
There isn't. I use that word many times. Momentum is with us, you might say.
Well, we'll come to that word a bit later. But how have you used your experience in retail to be a good politician? Because, of course, or I say a good one, a successful one, which you are, because you've won a term and you're doing very well there.
I suspect I'm not a very good politician, actually. And you know what? That doesn't really worry me. I hope I'm a good leader for the West Midlands, though. So
why not a good one? You can't fudge properly.
Well, because
you like clear decisions.
Because I believe the art is all actually about leadership. It's about decision making. It's getting the right things to happen. And actually the political process that leads to that, actually that leaves me fairly cold, actually. So I almost see myself as the chief executive of the West Midlands and what people elected me to do. And lots of people voted Labour all my life, but I'm going to vote for you, Andy, because you will make things happen. And I hope I've lived up to that.
What is your record in the West Midlands?
Well, I think it's a good record. We're going to see what people think of it. But the key points that I might draw out, obviously we've had great job creation ahead of the national average. Just in the last year, 26,000 jobs in the mayoral area, best improvement in employment rate in the country. And this, of course, is for an area that hasn't always been an economic success story. We needed to turn around.
It's a massive building site, isn't it?
It is. That's great. Nice of you to say it. But if you look at the skyline of Birmingham, the cranes are there, investments coming in. But if you look beyond Birmingham as well, this is important. It's not just about the big city centre. It's about communities in the Black Country who've been left behind, seeing investment. And one of the most important investments is about new housing. So if you get a train through the West Midlands, you'll pass industrial sites that have been derelict for 30 years. We're bringing them back to life. I said I'd build 25,000 homes in 3 years. We're about 40,000 and counting.
Are they delivered or trowels on the ground?
Some of them are delivered. Some of them are literally people going around the show homes. Others are just, of course, trowels in the ground. But it takes time to do that. So that's good. And then, of course, we said we would get investment for our transport infrastructure. And it's not just about HS2. It's about regional transport as well. And people can see that happening. Capital was spending on transport about 7 times what it used to be.
National parks are keen on, apparently.
We are.
Now, this big idea of bringing nature nearer to people living in cities. And one idea might be to put a national park on the doorstep of Birmingham. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's not. I didn't originate the idea. It was originated by a wonderful woman at Birmingham City University who looked at the sort of wetlands out to the east of the city, basically following the line HS2 will take, and saying this is an incredible regeneration opportunity. So let's actually clean it up and make it a national park for citizens.
And when can that happen?
It will happen steadily. You don't just do it in one piece. And actually, one of the wonderful things is it fits with a broader piece about climate change. We've just committed to carbon neutrality by 2041, and we're actually now going through the things that are going to happen across the whole of the West Midlands.
Right, forgive me.
And one of the things that will help in that, of course, the move to public transport, of course, the move to green and electric vehicles. So think about the whole automotive industry in the West Midlands, getting that green, great opportunity.
You've got to get to work, Andy. I mean, if the trains aren't there, you have to drive to work, and you can't say you can't drive to work, can you, to meet our carbon neutral figure?
I did not say you can't drive to work in the short term. You've got to do both. But we are investing in our public transport, reopening railway lines. Before the government got the idea of reversing the beaching, we're getting on with it, extending our metro system. And what we're seeing is more and more people taking public transport across the West Midlands.
What's your big ask from the government? HS2 is bubbling under. The Chancellor's now keen on it.
Yep.
You obviously are keen on it. Let's be quite clear on that.
I am. So that is the big ask. I mean, there are other things which we can come to, but the decisions facing the government now, HS2 is mission critical for the West Midlands. And the interesting thing about it, Chris, is it isn't a future tense thing for us. The decision was taken in 2015, and you've seen investment coming in on the back of that. You see a huge building site in the middle of Birmingham where the station's going to be, but the building's already coming around it. So the message is simple: hold your nerve. This is a big opportunity. The world will be watching. We mustn't in any way flinch.
And won't it free up capacity in the West Midlands for more stops on the existing line, because you've got the faster line going?
Yeah, great question. So people think this is, it's been sold on speed. That's not right.
It was originally, by the way.
It was originally,
and
it was the wrong thing to sell it on. It should be sold on economic regeneration and capacity on our rail network. And if I just make this really simple, if you get a train between Birmingham and Coventry, our two biggest stations, there's the high-speed line going from London through the Midlands to Scotland, and those trains share the track with a commuter train. That just doesn't work. So get high-speed trains on a separate dedicated line, then we can improve the commuter rail between our biggest two cities.
What's more important, Heathrow going ahead or HS2?
For us in the West Midlands, the biggest opportunity by far is HS2. No question about it.
It matters too much.
Yes.
CCHQ moved to Birmingham. Are you in talks?
Yes, we're putting in a bid. I'm sure others will be. But, what would be
the
more...
new library? I'm thinking of the area I know around the
yes, I think that CCHQ is not that big, for goodness sake. You've obviously got this impression the Conservative Party has legions of people. Not true. But an elegant office accommodation probably does need to be in Birmingham because it's got to be incredibly well connected across the country.
Yes.
So what would be more symbolic? The Red Wall was breached in the West Midlands. CCHQ comes to the West Midlands. I like that.
Are you a Brexiteer, Andy Street?
I was not a Brexiteer. You and I do not agree on this. I was...
Well, no, it's high vote, Andy, actually. I really support the Democratic mandate.
I think your celebration is clear. I was a Remainer, but I was never a Remoaner, if that makes sense. So I said right from the day after the vote, the people have spoken, we've now got to get on and do what people ask for. So I have huge respect for the fact that Boris has actually made that happen.
Do you see opportunity for the Midlands? JCB, big supporters of it. The big manufacturers in the West Midlands are very keen. The Midlands Industrial Council is a Conservative donor group, and they're massively keen.
No, it's a mixed picture, to be fair. Mixed picture. I mean, if you talk to JCB, you're absolutely right. But if you talk to JLR, the biggest manufacturer in the country, they have a different view. So it's mixed. So I think the truth is, we haven't got to worry about what's happened, but we've now got to think about how we're going to make the most of this going forward. And that does mean the free trade deal is absolutely critical, particularly for West Midlands manufacturers.
That's with the EU or US or elsewhere?
Actually, both. That's where the threat and opportunity comes. We need a free trade deal with Europe that enables us to continue with our just-in-time supply chains, but I'm also looking forward to a free trade deal with the US so that we can, and if you take JLR, the US is a huge export market.
How can you get your voice into those talks? The West Midlands voice?
Yeah. We already are, in the sense that Michael Gove I arranged for Michael Gove to come up and do a round table with big manufacturers. So he is an absolute critical voice, learnt, understood. That's what I did with the previous regime as well. And I will want to continue doing that. I would love actually to see a formal way that regions across the country were involved in some sort of advisory group around this. But I'm happy that direct contact with ministers has got them really to appreciate what's at stake.
But you have that because you're a senior Tory politician, but others haven't got the same advantage. But there needs to be this regional feed into...
absolutely, you're right. I think one of the reasons that I think I've done pretty reasonably in this job is I've used those connections with central government to be able to win for the West Midlands.
Is that what it's called? Advantage West Midlands?
That was the Regional Development Agency.
That's gone away now.
That went away and the LEPs came and I chaired one of those. Yeah. But this is much more recent. This is, do you use this role as the leader of the West Midlands to champion our interests and get straight on the phone to Cabinet Ministers? Answer, yes. But it is informal. And I'd very much like to see, as Lord Heseltine argued actually, for some permanent arrangement where there'd be some advisory group there.
Of course, the most important thing about Birmingham is it's the home of the Archers.
It is indeed. In the mailbox.
We're in the mailbox,
yes,
isn't it? You've been in the studio there?
I live in the studio at the mailbox.
You've made all the...
I've seen the people and you go in and, you know...
You made the squelching noises.
I've never actually performed as a cow or anything in the Archers, if that's the next
You're a great
question.
cow.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't know how to take that. But it's a lovely export from Birmingham. We do need more media, of course, in Birmingham. And
Channel 4 went to Leeds, not Birmingham.
Channel 4 went to Leeds. That was one we lost. We're still trying to understand just why. But you might have seen really exciting prospect that Stephen Knight, who is the producer-director of Peaky Blinders, a brilliant Birmingham export, of course, he is proposing, we're very close to the deal, to open a massive film studio there. So that creative industry in the heart of the city there could be great with Stephen.
Andy Street, Conservative candidate in the West Midlands mayoral elections. Thank you so much for coming on Chopper's Brexit podcast.
Well, thank you. I think I've enjoyed it.
Well, that's all for today. But before we go, I want to tell you briefly about another brilliant Telegraph podcast. It's called Crossfire, and it's launching next week. Our US editor, Ben Riley-Smith, has uncovered all the ways in which the UK was implicated in the Trump-Russia scandal in a really gripping 6-part series. It tells you some fascinating things about the UK-US relationship, and what better time to explore that, given the US presidential election is about to get going in earnest in the States. Search Crossfire on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favourite podcast app. The trailer is out now. Don't forget you can find all the best Telegraph subscription offers at telegraph.co.uk/chopper. Thank you to our guests this week, Garett Jones, Liam Fox, and of course, Andy Street. Thank you to the show's producers, Theodora Louloudis and Edith Lampitt, and to this week's superfan, Andrew Kersley. And a special shout out this week to Colin, the Red Lions pub landlord, who's retiring after years of epic service to politicians, special advisors and journalists in the Red Lion pub. If you had a pint of beer here, it was probably pulled by Colin. Huge thanks to you for listening and to those of you who have left reviews on Apple Podcasts. If you haven't, please do so. A 5-star rating really helps other people find this podcast. If you want to get in touch, we're on Twitter at Brexit Broadcast, or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. And finally, always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, cheerio!